Okay, so I'm just going to give you a bit of summary and exam review. It'll be a little bit of review for the course, and also talk about how the exam is going to function. As I said, it'll look very similar to the midterm with just one slight difference, but it'll also be 2 hours, and it'll be the same thing. You'll have to do like an ID, historical significance question, and 2 essays, okay? So what I'm going to do first is just talk to you about how the exam will first function. So the exam is due at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, August 25th. And you will get the exam. You'll have basically, let me just check the calendar here. You will get the exam on Tuesday, August 18th. So you will get the exam a week from today on August 18th, and then you will have to turn it in on August 25th at 3 p.m. on Quarkus. Now, just like the other exam at the midterm, we expect you to work 2 hours on it, no more. The reason we give you a week is, you guys are busy and you have family and work commitments. So you can fit the 2 hours in whenever you see fit, and you can upload it whenever you want. It's just due. The last time you can upload it is August 25th at 3 p.m. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of the course. Just talk about some of the things that you'll have to know, and then I'll look at the structure of the exam and give you some study tips. Okay, so if you remember, the course was divided up into these 6 kind of units of the course. We started by looking at the classic case, right? The emergence of capitalism in Western Europe, specifically England, right? We looked at how the crisis of feudalism led to the English commercial agriculture, right? Which we looked at how the peasants were basically dispossessed from their land through the enclosure movement, which in turn created a dual market for both labor and commodities. We saw the emergence of that landlord, tenant, wage labor nexus, right? When peasants were kicked off their land, all of a sudden landlords could charge whatever rent they wanted. They could raise rent every year, which then created the incentive for these tenant farmers to become more efficient, divide labor, and it meant that they needed less and less workers on their farmland, which then created the basis for much more of these peasants to move into the cities, which allowed that dual market of labor and commodities, right? Because these peasants were now dispossessed from the means of production, right? They no longer had access to the land. The only way they could survive was to buy foodstuffs, to buy commodities. And the only way they could buy foodstuff and commodities was to sell their labor to somebody else. And this is the beginning where you get the creation of this new form of economic system, what many theorists of capitalism sometimes refer to as these distinct laws of motion that set beginning with the emergence of commercial agriculture in England, and set England and then eventually the world on the path to what becomes industrial capitalism. We saw about the rise of merchant capital and the role that merchant capital played in the emergence of capitalism in the classic case. We looked at different elements of merchant capital. We looked at merchant capital in China. We looked at merchant capital in the Islamic world. We looked at merchant capital in northern Italy, the Hanseatic League. We looked at the creation of these these trading systems that emerged in the Mediterranean and the North Sea, all these kinds of things in the classic case that would eventually culminate in the rise of capitalism when merchants start moving into production in that period between like the 17th and the late 18th century, right? When merchants start to take control of production, right? That's when you get capitalism proper, right? The move from merchant capital being invested in simply the carrying trade, right? Moving goods from one part of the world to the other part of the world, that's all it was. But once by the mid to late 18th century, merchants start investing in production. That's the beginning of what we often refer to as capitalism proper, which fundamentally alters the world. We also looked at the role of the state in imperial expansion and the emergence of slavery and the role that slavery played in capitalism. As we talked about a little bit this lecture, we looked at what initially started as that kind of crown capitalism in Spain, which emerged into these kind of state-backed corporations like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, the Royal Africa Company for the exploitation of the slave trade. And then, of course, we saw that triangle of trade system emerge in England, right? Slaves from Africa, raw materials from the New World, manufactured goods in England that was then exported back to the New World and Africa to trade for slaves and raw materials. And we looked at the emergence of classes and class formation in the next unit. We looked at how capitalism creates two distinct classes of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the owners of capital and the people who have nothing but their labor to sell, who are dispossessed of all capital. We also complicated that even though capitalism produces the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they're divided amongst themselves, right? There's different types of bourgeoisies, there's different types of capital, there's different types of manufacturing operations, and they don't necessarily agree on every one thing. Sometimes they're divided by nations, sometimes they're divided by regional areas, sometimes it's by industry, right? Finance capital has different interests than, say, manufacturing capital. And as far as the emergence of the proletariat goes, it can be divided by race, gender, class, skill, unskilled, geographic area, age, all different kinds of ways that even though you get the emergence of these two distinct classes, right, we also see that amongst those classes there is potentially division. And one of the things that the bourgeoisie, or the owners of capital, have been very successful at doing is dividing the proletariat by emphasizing and exploiting those differences between race, class, caste, gender, age, skill, non-skill, geographic region, whatever. Right? I mean, we see it today in the United States as well. And from there, we then looked at the logic of capital and looked at markets and how they functioned and primitive accumulation and the idea of surplus value and what that was, right? How surplus value is extracted from workers and how workers are not actually paid what they're actually worth. We saw the emergence of the division of labor that started to happen in the 18th century but was articulated by Adam Smith in his work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, that the most efficient way to produce anything was the division of labor, right? The move from master craftsmen to the division of labor into small menial tasks that allowed for a much more efficient form of production and allowed much more things to be produced. And then we saw how the creation and the expansion of the goods that was being able to produce by these merchants that had moved into production sought them to seek out new markets and create, in some ways, national and regional markets that forced them to create more and more product and divide labor even further, culminating in the factory system where production is now centralized. We looked at the role of, say, women and children in the emergence of industrial capitalism in the early 19th century. And we looked at how markets function, how markets always seek to expand. We looked at liberal and Marxian critiques of how capital functions. Right? We looked at the Communist Manifesto. We looked at the way Marx thinks about it philosophically, how Marx moved from his philosophical contribution of looking at society from the bottom, the substructure, right? What is the base social and economic relations of production? All of that is what structures everything that comes on top of it. Politics, culture, religion, the state, all of these things emerge from that substructure. And that's, again, the logic of how capitalism functions. And from there, in the second semester, we then turned our attention to capitalism and politics. We looked at the emergence of liberalism and liberal thought, specifically with Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and then Adam Smith. Of course, Thomas Hobbes is the father of liberalism. He creates this idea of secularizing authority, right, under this kind of new form of government. Didn't necessarily have to be democratic. John Locke, of course, his great contribution was this theory of property, where property could be defined by improvement, that if you could improve something, you had a greater title to that property than, say, somebody else. It created this incentive that you didn't stagnate in your possession. It also, on the other hand, created a very convenient justification for the dispossession of land or property from people that was perceived to be, at least in the European context, unproductive. But again, it's a very specific form of unproductiveness. And when we got, again, to capitalism and politics, when we looked at revolutions, we looked at the English Revolution, the French Revolution, and the American Revolution, as well as the Haitian Revolution, which was connected to the French Revolution. And in all three of these revolutions, what emerges is the acceleration of capitalist expansion, right? And again, these revolutions weren't necessarily something that started where you had feudalism and ended with capitalism, right? It was about the imposition and creation of a new liberal state in both England, the United States, and then eventually France, right? And what this did was it created the conditions, especially with the way property rights were now secure in all of those places, for the acceleration of capitalism. In England, you got the creation of a constitutional monarchy with a parliament made up largely of property owners and landowners. Something I think was Christopher Hill referred to as the Committee of Landowners is what you could think of Parliament. In the United States, you got the freeing up of capital. You got the emergence of a society in which trade was intensified, in which the continent of North America was open to exploitation, at least that's how they justified it, to the expanding settler economy. I mean, in France, of course, we saw this kind of bourgeois revolution that created the conditions for the acceleration of capitalism after, the erosion of feudal privilege, the abolition of the monarchy, and in the case of France, initially the abolition of slavery, which of course doesn't happen in the American Revolution. Slavery is strengthened after the American Revolution. And then we see the emergence of the revolution in Haiti, whereby slaves rebel, culminating in the successful establishment of the Haitian Republic in 1804. And that was capitalism and politics. And again, all of those revolutions created the conditions for capitalism to flourish. It wasn't necessarily about instituting capitalism. And then when we looked at critiques of the classic model in the next unit, we first started looking at the persistence of unfree labor. I suggested that capitalism has always depended on non-capitalist forms of production to flourish. And we saw this. We looked at 2 case studies looking at indentured servitude in the American colonies of Virginia and Maryland in the 1600s and early 1700s. And we also looked at a case study of the British Empire, specifically looking at how when the British Empire banned slavery in the 1830s, how there was still this persistence of unfree labor that wasn't slavery. We saw in the emergence of what is quote-unquote called the coolie trade, where Indian and Chinese indentured servants were brought to the New World to work on sugar plantations, largely because the British didn't know how to deal with the end of slavery, and the kind of white supremacist way of thinking at the time assumed that people from that part of the world could not work hard unless they were coerced into doing it. Now again, indentured servitism or coolieism is not slavery per se, but it has a lot of the markers of slavery. Again, it's distinct. You are not born into it. It does not pass down to your children like slavery does, but it is a form of unfree labor. And I encourage you to think of unfree labor as a spectrum, with slavery at the most extreme end of unfreedom and wage labor at the most extreme end of freedom. And that, again, looks at problems with the classic model, where what capitalism was supposed to end unfree forms of labor. They were supposed to be a relic of a feudal past, but as we've seen, unfree forms of labor has persisted. And again, the suggestion I made was that capitalism always depends on certain forms of unfree labor. From there, we continued our discussion about critiques of the classic model by looking at alternative paths to capitalism. We looked at 3 case studies, starting with I believe it was the American South, and we looked at how they took the Prussian road to capitalism, that is capitalism without liberal democracy, where after the Civil War and the end of slavery, the system of sharecropping emerged that essentially wasn't the same as slavery, but in many ways created a lot of the same conditions, where African American sharecroppers were tied to their land. As a result, fell into a system of debt dependency that didn't end until the collapse of the plantation economy in the 1930s and the acceleration of capitalist production moving into the South by the 1940s and the 1950s. So what we saw was this slow move after the Civil War, where you got a certain element of commercialism, but without liberal democracy, which is why it's referred to as the Prussian road of capitalism. After that, there was that discussion between myself and Professor Halperin about South Africa's move toward capitalism. And in that case, the state, or the imperial state, was the prime mover in bringing about a capitalist transformation in South Africa, particularly the British imperial state, and how it brought about a revolution in the mining of minerals, of gold and diamonds specifically in South Africa. And again, I encourage you to go back and look at some of those lectures. And then the final case we looked at with alternative paths was Japan, where again the state is the primary mover, but it's this revolution from above, where you get a kind of bourgeois revolution but without a bourgeoisie, where even though those other revolutions that occurred in England, the United States, and France allowed capitalism to flourish, there was no self-conscious effort on the part of the revolutionary coalitions to bring about capitalism. But in the case of Japan, that was actually true, right? That the state that had taken over in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, 1867 actually was trying Japan to bring about a form of industrial capitalism so that Japan would not be subjugated in the same way that was happening to China across the Sea of Japan in the mid-19th century, which of course by 1910, 1920, Japan had emerged as a modern industrial and imperial power to rival all the great empires of the world. And then from there, we turn to late capitalism, beginning with which was the look at the rise of big business and the managerial revolution, right? This is when we looked at vertical and horizontal integration, the emergence of monopoly and oligopolistic business practices, all of which emerged out of the railway industry in the United States, which created that national market, which then created the conditions for these massively large corporations to emerge, like Homestead Steel under Andrew Carnegie, or Standard Oil under J.D. Rockefeller, American Tobacco, which emerged from James Buchanan Duke, how they solved these problems of perpetual production by securing access to raw materials. In the case of vertical integration with Andrew Carnegie, right, that was vertical integration backward toward production versus, say, the tobacco and meat packing industry, which was vertically integrated more toward the market, where they created modern advertising to manufacture the demand for cigarettes, which were being overproduced. And James Buchanan Duke had to create demand. In the meatpacking industry, we see both. We see vertical integration toward and away from the market, right? They secure raw material, in this case, livestock and animals for production, and also a marketing department to tell people how this new system of meat distribution works with the refrigerated boxcar and all of that. We also saw the emergence of scientific management under Frederick Winslow Taylor, these time motion studies, where businessmen could now accurately predict what their profits were going to be. They had a very specific way of measuring how much time it should take each worker to do a task. It was about training workers, not finding the best worker necessarily. And then from there, we continued our discussion of late capitalism by looking at the emergence of the global assembly line, beginning with that new phase of liberalism and capitalism in the early 20th century, where you saw that kind of regulated capitalism, both in the private and public sector. We saw the rise of Fordism, where Henry Ford was able to produce so much more by applying the assembly line to automotive production. But then, you know, he had all these millions of cars to sell, so his solution was to create a market by paying his workers more so that these workers could now afford to buy the very thing that they were creating. And then from there, we saw how this developed by the late 60s and early 70s into the maquiladora system, where production was then globalized, and you got the emergence of this new global assembly line, where you moved production to cheaper labor markets with weak regulation, kept, say, in the United States, a kind of white-collar jobs that went along with that company. And then when that ended, we looked in our last lecture that we just looked at today, the rise of neoliberalism, where it came from, how the crisis of the 1970s created the opportunity for the followers of von Hayek to bring about this new system of political economic governance that has created the world that we live in today. That, as I said in that lecture, has been not very successful at regenerating capital accumulation, but has been very successful at restoring the power of economic elites in society. And again, despite the fact that the state is supposed to have a smaller role, which is true to a certain extent, the state is still a dynamic actor in neoliberalism. It's just that it acts in the interest of this economic elite more so than it does with everybody else. And again, we ended by pointing the way forward to see what the next phase of capitalism could potentially be. All right, so that's just kind of a quick review of everything we've discussed. If we just want to look at like key concepts, for example, in the classic case, a lot of the key concepts were things like historiography, the means of production, the mode of production, relations of production. Historiography, of course, is what historians say about history. The means of production is, the things that are required for production. So in the case of feudalism, the means of production would be the land, right? In the case of capitalism, industrial capitalism, would be the tools and the factories that actually make the product. The mode of production is the system, right? Feudalism or capitalism, right? Or the artisanal system, right? Are modes of productions. Relations of productions is how the people within that system relate to one another. What is the relationship between a wage laborer and his or her employee? What is the relationship between a peasant and a landlord? What is the relationship between a journeyman and a master craftsman? That's relations of production. And we looked at the key concepts of classes and class formation, right? We looked at the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, which I explained earlier, the owners of capital versus people that own nothing except their ability to sell their labor, how this is divided by race, gender, and skill. When we looked at the logic of capital, we looked at what capital was, primitive accumulation, that original accumulation that allowed that shift to capitalism. So that kind of primitive accumulation in England would have been the dispossession of the peasants and the enclosure movement. You can also see definitions for primitive accumulation in the lecture on unfree labor as well. Surplus value is the value that is extracted from workers, right? And we use that study where if a worker was able to work at a certain rate every 15 minutes, the value that they generate is much more than the actual wage that they're getting paid. It has to be, because if it wasn't, the owner would actually make no money. We looked at wages and profits. We looked at the market, which is this constant expansion of essentially a medium to exchange commodities is really what the market is. We looked at the difference between use value and exchange value. Exchange value matters more in the market. A use value, if you remembered, was how useful something is, right? The example I used was a watch. A Rolex and a Timex have the same use value. They tell time. They have a different exchange value. One is worth far more than the other, right? Under a market society, which is another key thing, right? We looked at what is a society with markets versus a market society. Society with markets is where markets fit into social relations that are pre-existing. In a market society, social relationships are fit into the market more so than anything else. And it's perpetually expanding. It is a medium to exchange commodities, right? The key concept when we looked at critiquing the classic case was unfree labor, of course, slavery in the plantation complex, which you guys already know, combined and uneven development. This is the idea that capitalism develops, but unevenly, right? It develops differently in different parts. And this was this idea that capitalism has always depended on non-capitalist forms of production, right? That's the unevenness of capitalism. You could get a lot of economic growth in one area, but very little economic growth in the other area. And as a result of that, certain operations can move into that underdeveloped area because that area would expect lower wages, right? Again, we looked at those alternative paths as I went about earlier. And then the key concepts for late capitalism is things like monopoly, the state, horizontal and vertical integration, Fordism, globalism, and neoliberalism. And I'm not going to go over too much. You know what a monopoly is. It's when one company controls most of the industry. An example is Standard Oil in 1880 controlled 90% of the oil business. The state, you know what it is. Horizontal integration, of course, is when a business expands horizontally by essentially buying up the competition. Vertical integration, as I said earlier, is the opposite, where you buy different businesses in the chain of production. So for the case of Homestead Steel, it was iron and coal mines, freighters in the Great Lakes to transport the raw material, railroads to transport the raw material, the steel production business itself, and then a small marketing department. All right. So some of the questions we're going to, and I'm just going to again go over, you're going to get it on August 18th at noon. It's going to be due electronically August 25th at 3 p.m. There's 3 sections to the exam. There's short identifications that are going to look very similar to the midterm. It's worth 20%. And then there's 2 sections, essay sections. You only have to answer 1 essay question per section. So in essay section 1, it will be content from the midterm onwards. So in this section, the questions will deal with only things that happen after the break. So from the lecture on liberal democratic revolutions all the way to the lecture on neoliberalism is what that will cover. The second essay question, essay section number 2, will cover the entire course. It will cover everything from the first lecture on the crisis of feudalism all the way to neoliberalism. These questions will be much more expansive in nature. They will be bigger. It'll allow you to think big about the exam. And again, like a lot of the things that will be on the short identifications will be things like this: monopoly, Fordism, vertical integration, plantation complex, that kind of thing. And again, the key thing with answering the ID questions is what it is, but also why does it matter in the history of capitalism? What its significance? Why should anybody care about Fordism? What is the significance of Fordism in the history of capitalism? That's what you're trying to do. Think of it as a mini essay on why these things matter. And we're talking about a paragraph, no more. Now, some study tips. Always review your notes, secure notes you don't have, catch up on your readings that you missed or did hastily, figure out which readings are the most important, right? Distill your notes, do not cram facts, identify and work to understand key concepts. And again, I mean, the good thing about recording these lectures is you can go back and look over things that you haven't looked at yet, which is why I try to break them up in the way that they are. So just studying for a longer period of time. So if you study like an hour a day from now until, say, next Tuesday, that's better than, say, studying for 5 hours on Sunday and Monday. Okay, so let's just go for some sample questions here, right? So again, for short IDs, it could be things like the division of labor, the universal market, or the means of production. Again, you want to explain what they are, but more importantly, what their significance they have in the history of capitalism. Now, some sample essay questions could be, in what ways did monopoly capital address the chronic problem of overproduction? Another one could be the social relations of the Prussian road to capitalism not only guarantee an abundant supply of low-cost labor, they were also incompatible with liberal democracy. Discuss. Now, that's a much more open-ended question, whereas the first one is a much more narrow question, but just gives you an example of what's actually going to be on there. Okay, so tips on answering the essay questions. Answer the actual question. This is key. When you're writing, always go back and make sure you're answering the question, because sometimes when you're writing, it can really get away from you at this point. Refer to the readings and the lectures, always. So you want to refer to them. You don't have to cite them like informal citations, but just be as specific as you can and always use specific examples. It's not enough to talk about, say, if you're writing an essay on liberal democratic revolutions, to say something like, well, these revolutions created the basis for the acceleration of capitalism. You have to explain specifically how that is. So you would look at a specific example in either the English, American, or French Revolution and say, okay, here's a specific example of how these revolutions allowed for, say, the securitization of property, right? So an example with England could be the fact that you got more of a constitutional monarchy and that power had shifted to Parliament, which was controlled by landowners. In the case of France, you could look at the destruction of the guild system, right? The abolition of feudal privileges and all these kinds of things, right? Specific examples, right? You need to name specific things that happened, the specific people that made them happen. That's what we mean by specific examples. It's not enough to just say, if you're writing an essay on liberal democratic revolutions and how they created the conditions for capitalism to flourish, it's not enough to just say, oh, well, the revolutions happened, and then as a result of that, it became a more capitalist society. You have to point to specific examples, and you want to be as nuanced as possible. You want to consider alternative points of view if you're making an argument. And then what you would do, ideally, is try to explain why that alternative point of view is either doesn't make sense, or you incorporate it into a kind of synthesis about an argument, right? You want to muster the best possible prose you can. I know in 2 hours, it's not that easy to write really well and muster really good prose, but just do your best. Always edit and proofread your essays, right? This is so important, especially in a take-home exam. Just always edit and proofread your essays, okay? Anyway, I'll leave it at that. If you have any more questions about the exam, don't hesitate to contact me or one of the TAs.